Alright, this is going to be a general guide to making tritium and frezon on the frontier. Some of this information is applicable to other servers too, namely frezon synthesis seems to be created the same just about everywhere. I'll try to make a note of what about the frontier is different from upstream, which if you're on another server that isn't upstream, then you'll need to check your own server code base to see what's different, but ideally a lot of these principles are going to work everywhere. Also, I'm doing this on an ambition in admin mode on a debug realm, but again, this is about learning the principles, so you can do this on just about any ship, just about any station. We've done frezon on Gaslights, we've done frezon recently, I think someone did it on a Bocadillo. Again, these are principles. Once you're better at Atmos, you'll learn how to fit these into smaller and smaller spaces. Alright, to start with, we'll be making tritium. I do have a tritium miner, that's for later. We're going to be making it the proper way. You won't have access to a tritium miner. Tritium is created when you mix oxygen and plasma together above plasma's ignition temperature of 373 Kelvin. In order to get tritium from that reaction, it needs to be in an oxygen-rich environment, usually called supersaturation. What counts as an oxygen-rich environment varies from server to server. Upstream, I believe it's 96:1 ratio of oxygen to plasma. Here on the frontier, we have a more lenient ratio of 30:1 oxygen to plasma. If you are below that ratio, so if you don't have enough oxygen, you'll end up creating carbon dioxide instead of tritium, which is wasteful because you're using up plasma and creating carbon dioxide, which you can recycle into oxygen again, but you've lost your plasma, which is no good. So in general, we'll be striving to create those conditions of 373 Kelvin in an oxygen-rich environment inside what's called a burn chamber. On most stations, your burn chamber is going to be a 3x3 box that's pre-built usually. On the frontier, we usually shrink our burn chambers down to 1x3, and in general, you're just going to start a fire in there. So to start building this, I'm going to be using the admin panel. So directional, reinforced plasma window. And so this is going to be our little burn chamber. On the left, we'll be adding our we're going to be adding our oxygen with a passive vent. And to control how much oxygen we're adding, we're going to use a pump and just a pressure pump, which technically these are called gas pumps. I usually call them pressure pumps to delineate them, make it clear that I'm talking about the one that works with pressure. Then on the right, we're going to be injecting our plasma, which might as well use an injector. You can also use a passive vent for this, but injector is a little bit friendlier for this purpose. And then we're going to have a very common setup when we're doing Atmos to control the flow of gas. I don't know if it has a name, but it's a sequence of 3 devices. It's a volumetric pump, a signal valve, then a pressure pump. I'm going to close this now so it doesn't have that annoying sound. And the idea of this setup is that this gas pump at the bottom controls the pressure leading into this valve. This valve will block flow when we don't want to be injecting gas. And when we open it, it'll allow gas to flow through to this volumetric pump. And then this volumetric pump pulls the gas out of this and into wherever we're putting it. And this gas pump here, the pressure one, controls how much we're injecting at a time. And the signal valve obviously controls whether or not we're injecting. If you don't use this gas pump here, if you omit it, then you're going to be doing what we call shotguns, which is just injecting a ton of gas at once. There are use cases for that, but in general, you're going to want to have the pressure pump before the signal valve. For the oxygen, we're not doing this because we just can set this to some value like 150. And this will naturally control how much oxygen is in the chamber because we only have 2 gases, oxygen and plasma. So if we control how much plasma is in the chamber, we're also naturally at the same time controlling how much oxygen is in the chamber. In the middle, we're going to be scrubbing out tritium as well as other waste products. Sorry, admin panel. And then ideally, you're only creating tritium. However, in my opinion, it's always best to have a filter to make sure that you're only getting tritium in this line, because if you do make a mistake, which as you're learning, you're going to make mistakes, even experienced Atmos techs make mistakes all the time. So I think it's better to have some way to filter your tritium out of the other waste products, just in case you accidentally create water or carbon dioxide. Then on the frontier, it's very important that we cool this. The reason we need to cool this on the frontier is that tritium and plasma have different ignition temperatures. As mentioned before, plasma ignites at 373 Kelvin, while tritium ignites at 700 Kelvin. So if you keep the temperature between those two values, you'll be creating tritium, but it won't be hot enough to burn your tritium. Burning tritium obviously wastes it, so by keeping the burn chamber cold, but still warm enough to ignite the plasma, but by keeping it cool, we can prevent wasting our tritium. Upstream, the tritium and plasma ignite at the same temperature of 373 Kelvin, and that's also going to be true of a lot of other servers. The difference in temperature between those two is what often people cite as like part of what makes Frontier Atmos so much more engaging, because you get these benefits from cooling your fires properly. In any case, you'd need cooling less upstream, but cooling is still beneficial upstream because colder gases take up less space, and if they're taking up less space, it means you can fit more fuel inside the chamber and create tritium faster. So cooling's good either way, it's just way more important on Frontier. In order to cool it, we're going to be adding radiators, and I'll be doing this the standard way to prove that you can actually just stack these. So radiator, these just fit underneath devices, so you can do this. Then build it, and it just works. And then additionally, we're going to want another sensor. And this can go anywhere in the chamber. Technically, you don't need the sensor. I like having it, but come on, build the sensor. Technically, you don't need it. A lot of setups omit the sensor, but I like having it for reasons we'll see in a bit. And once this is set up, we'll need a way to ignite it. So I've got a remote signaler and igniter. So we just link defaults. Link defaults. We put this in here, and then when we're ready to go, we can press this button and it'll light it up. At this point, we're not quite ready. We'll need an air alarm or two. Get these two air alarms down. Oops. Do this through the admin so I don't have to actually construct it. And then we're going to be set your multi-tool to list. You're going to first take the scrubber, set it to one of these, add it, and then clear the list. And then you're going to take the air sensor and add it to the other one. And now we're ready to seal this up, so we can just go structural reinforced plasma, close this off. This is on, and then this we set to a low value like 10. So at this point, we can start hooking stuff up. So we'll go pipes, connect it to our oxygen. And then our plasma. And our waste gases will be coming out of the filter this way. Which there are uses for the waste gases, but for this, and for most cases, you're just going to send them into space and not think about it. And then our tritium comes off of this. And then hot tritium, it's going to come out of the chamber hot because, it's hot in there, and then we suck it out and it's going to continue to be hot. Technically, this isn't needed, but it's always recommended to somewhere along the line, you do pump, radiator, pump. And this will cool down our tritium so that it's not so hot when it goes. Oops, I put that wrong. So it's not so hot. Again, generally it's safe to just keep hot tritium, but there's no reason to leave it so hot. Hot tritium obviously can ignite with oxygen. You're going to be mixing with oxygen eventually, because that's the only use for tritium. So just cool it down, works out better. And to do that, we're going to need a fire axe, which can rip up floor tiles on Frontier, and then we're going to be sealing this one tile out and making it spaced. Turn these on, both of them set to max. And clean up a bit after ourselves. So this is ready to start burning. However, we've not connected these radiators up to anything. So we're going to be building our cooling loop next. Gone ahead and colored our pipes to keep things clearer, but otherwise the setup's the exact same. Anyway, cooling. I'm going to have my loop be clockwise. If your plasma's on the left instead of the right, it's just going counterclockwise. In practice, it doesn't make too much of a difference though. Basically, this radiator here on the right, if we're going clockwise, so if we're going this kind of direction-ish, then this radiator on the right is going to have the coldest gas, and having it underneath where we put the plasma is slightly better. Doesn't make that much of a difference. Anyway, people have a number of ways to do cooling. A current popular one on Frontier is called two-stage. I use a classic radiator snake with a signal valve to control it. Some people do direct gas mixing, which is technically the most effective, but also the wackiest. Really doesn't matter though, as long as you achieve cooling somehow. For my setup, we'll be using a signal valve to control whether cooling is active or not. A lot of cooling setups will just have cooling on all the time with no on-off, and they control how much cooling is done via pump settings, but I like the valve, and so that's what I'm going to be teaching. And then another note for cooling, one thing you'll see a lot of is the use of filters. The important thing to note is that filters don't have to filter. You can set them to none, in which case they just act as a volumetric pump, but better. So a filter can move up to 1,000 liters per tick, whereas a volumetric can only move 200 liters per tick. So they just move gas faster, and the only reason to use a volumetric over a filter is that the filter comes with this extra pipe hanging off the side, which can interfere with some other setups. Additionally, there are ways to use filters to turn gas. So like, since it's going, this is filtering tritium. Tritium is going to come in the top, enter here, and then turn left, which is our right looking at it. But you know, the tritium is making a left turn from its perspective. And it's doing that at 1,000 liters per tick. And so a volumetric pump is, a filter is just a volumetric pump that can move gas 5 times faster and can turn corners. So we're going to be using a lot of filters here. Just pretend like they're volumetric pumps. When you're doing your own, you can just use volumetric pumps if that's what you're more comfortable with. But the filters will move things faster and cool faster. Anyway, the actual build. We're going to have an in pump and an out pump. So we're going to have our filter. We're going to have our, we're going to have it here and here. And then we're going to have a signal valve on the inlet side here, and then we're going to be connecting these up with pipes. And the reason I'm placing this filter here so far away from the radiator is that radiators work better if they have a little bit of volume to work with. So by adding the pipes before the pump, this radiator at the end is slightly more effective. And then kind of a similar story here by putting the valve a little bit farther away from this pump is able to move more gas out of this volume here, which makes this first pump pretty effective. You don't need to have these gaps. Having the pumps right next to the radiators and the valve right next to the pump will work just fine. These are just minor improvements. So we're going to be turning pretty much all of our filters on and set to none. So they just act as really strong volumetric pumps. And then we're going to need a way to get these into space. And so to do that, I'll be placing pipes underneath walls, which if you didn't know, you can just do. So I'm going to do that with the regular construction menu. You don't need to rip up the wall to place a pipe. So you can just build it underneath as long as you have access to it. So you can just come up here and build it. And now underneath this, there is a pipe. Same thing on this side. And so now we have gas able to come into our radiators out from space. So we'll move out there. All right, now here we're just going to have, again, in, out, or really, since we're out here, this will be our in for this area and our out for this area. And this on the right is the in for our burn chamber, and this on the left is the out for our burn chamber. And we're just going to be creating some radiators and a nice little snake. So we'll have straight radiator here, here, and here. And then we're going to have bent radiators here, 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 and here. Then in between them, we're going to have our pumps, which we're going to be using filters again, stronger pumps. Ups, downs. We could just turn these on. Now gas is going to flow through here, up into here, come through the pump radiators, and then back through. And so as long as this valve on the right is open, gas is going to be flowing through this, going through these radiators out in space and cooling down, which then comes into this burn chamber, goes through these radiators, picks up heat from the burn chamber, moves it through here, radiates into space, and that's our coolant. So I'm going to go back and set up our air alarms now. All right, before we do the air alarms, one thing I forgot to mention is that we'll need to actually fill this coolant loop with some kind of gas to be able to move the heat around. Currently it's empty, so not going to be very good at moving heat from here to here if there's not a way to pick up the heat and actually move it. When you first make your burn chamber, you're only going to have access to plasma. You won't have frezon yet. However, frezon is the best coolant. That is like its intended role as a gas, is it has an extremely high thermal mass, has an extremely high thermal heat, extremely high specific heat, which means it's very good at picking up heat from one place and moving it to another without expanding a ton and clogging your pipes. So we're going to be using frezon because we can. Again, if you only have access to plasma, plasma works just fine. It's just slightly less efficient. Anyway, we're going to use a 4-way pipe here because we'll need a place to inject gas, but it's also useful to be able to pull gas out. Frezon is valuable, so when you go to sell, it's good to have a way to pull gas out of your coolant loop in order to sell it as well. And we're just going to have a little gas pump and a connector port. We're going to put a frezon can on top of it. Again, plasma works just fine. Frezon is just slightly better. We're going to set this to a low value to start with. And that's going to get gas moving. And we can watch over here as it builds up. So if we close this off, you can watch it build up. And basically we're looking for what temperature and pressure this is. Eventually this temperature is going to reach around 700 or more Kelvin. And so we want to make sure that when it's at that higher temperature, the pressure won't be clogging our pipes. So give it a little bit. And I'm going to stop it at around probably like 600, 700 kilopascal. Try it right now. We're going to turn this off, and if this proves to be not enough coolant, we can always add more later, but this is a decent place to start. So it'll filter through and slowly bring it up to around 1,000 as it comes through this radiator loop and collects at the back of this signal valve. All right, setting up our air alarms now. We've got 2 sensors separate and 2 air alarms. Whenever you're making air alarms, it's generally a good idea to make sure that whatever they're sensing, so one of them's on this scrubber and the other one's on the sensor, make sure they're separate so that you don't overlap. The sensing, like what you're sensing, is tied to the device, not the air alarm. So if you're trying to sense 2 different things, you'll need 2 separate sensors as well as 2 air alarms rather than some other combination. So one of these air alarms is going to be used for controlling this plasma signal valve, and the other air alarm is going to be used for controlling this coolant signal valve. So for the plasma, we're going to come to the sensor, disable pressure, because we're not worried about basically if the pressure in this chamber is low or if it's high, we don't care. The plasma can go in either way because it's going through an injector which has a much higher pressure threshold. Temperature, though, we do care about. So, again, on Frontier, we're worried about the temperature getting above 700 Kelvin, so we're going to emit a warning if it's above, say, 650 Kelvin. Actually, for starting this off, we're going to lower that to 550 to make sure everything's working. Eventually, you're going to raise it up because the closer you get to 700 Kelvin without actually going over 700 Kelvin, the more efficient the reaction is. But starting out lower always works. It's also good to turn off auto mode. Talk about that in a moment. And then for gases, we don't care about the oxygen threshold. We don't care about the nitrogen threshold. Carbon. Plasma we do care about. We'll come back to that. Tritium we don't care about. Water we don't care about. Ammonia we don't care about. Nitrous we don't care about. Frezon we don't care about. Respiron we don't care about. And helium we don't care about. So for plasma, we do care about it. And we're going to emit a warning if it's above around 1.5% plasma. So at this point, this air alarm is set up so that if the statistics, the situation, the conditions, that's the right word, the conditions in this chamber, if the conditions are such that the plasma goes above 1.5%, like the total concentration of plasma in the chamber is above 1.5%, this air alarm will give a warning. What we're going to do is take our multi-tool and link this air alarm to the signal valve. And if you receive a warning, we're going to close the valve. But under normal conditions, it's going to be open. I'm going to manually close it so it doesn't make sound. But under normal conditions, it'll be open. So if it is, again, the only two things on are temperature and plasma. So if it's below 550 Kelvin and the plasma is below 1.5%, then that valve will open and there will be an open path from this pump to the injector, and we'll be putting plasma into the chamber to burn. If either of these are true, if plasma is above 1.5%, or if the temperature is above 550 Kelvin, then this valve will shut off. And when the valve shuts off, we stop injecting plasma into the chamber, and plasma is sort of like our fuel to the fire. If you stop adding wood logs to your bonfire, it's going to eventually die out. And so by stop adding fuel, we're going to cool it down, and once it's cooled back down, then we start adding fuel back up again. The reason we have this plasma sensor is that we don't want to make carbon dioxide. If you're upstream, this will be a lower number. It'll be closer to like 0.7. But on Frontier, most people use 1.5 as a good number. You can go up to 3% plasma. However, plasma is very valuable. You don't want to accidentally make carbon dioxide, so we usually keep it a bit lower just to be safe. It's always worth remembering that there's going to be a delay between your signals and things happening, because when this valve closes, there's still going to be gas after the valve, inside this pump, and inside the injector. So despite the valve closing, you don't immediately stop adding plasma. You're going to get a little bit more plasma trickling in. It's just going to stop the flow in the future. And then the last thing we need to do with this is that this is our scrubber. And so this scrubber in the middle is meant to be pulling out everything except oxygen and plasma. So we're going to turn those two off and everything else on, and we're going to set it to wide net. And what wide net does is normally a scrubber only filters directly on top of itself. By setting it to wide net, you also get filtration on the 4 cardinal directions around it. These two, top and bottom, are blocked by windows, so it won't be filtering there, but it'll be able to filter left and right. And so it'll be pulling tritium out of the whole chamber. And since we set it so that it's pulling everything, it's going to leave oxygen, plasma, and if we ever make carbon dioxide, water, or anything else on accident, it's also going to pull those out of the chamber, so that the only thing left is oxygen and plasma. On this right one, this is what we're going to be linking to our coolant valve. So under warning, we're going to open, and under normal conditions, it's going to stay closed. So we've got to set this up now. So we don't care about pressure. We don't care about any gases. We're going to go through and turn all these off. You'll get the muscle memory for doing this pretty quickly, but it's just scroll down and click twice. So for temperature, we're going to emit a warning if it's above the same temperature that we used on the other side. They don't have to be the exact same temperature, but this has to be at or below the temperature that you used for plasma. Otherwise, you'll end up stalling, where the temperature will get stuck. Like if you set this to 650, for example, and that one's on 550, then what's going to happen is that you're going to end up at a temperature like 575 or 600, where since the temperature in the chamber is at 600, this valve will have closed thanks to that air alarm being at warning. Since there's no fuel going in, you'll not be creating burn, you'll not be creating heat. However, since it's still below 550, your coolant will be off and not cooling it back down, you'll just stall. So whatever you're doing, make sure that this air alarm is set to give a warning at the same temperature as that one, or slightly below it. Alright, going to go through a full overview one more time of everything. We've got oxygen on the left being controlled by this pump here. This controls how much oxygen we're putting in the chamber, so we're going to turn this on and start bringing in our oxygen. And if you're ever trying to see what's going on inside the chamber, this gas pump here, since it's connected to a passive vent, you can look at the outlet side to see what the situation inside the chamber is. And for the first burn, you're going to want to use a low pressure, because at this point, the gas isn't warm, so it hasn't expanded yet, so the temperature is going to rise pretty quickly once you actually start burning. So it's good to use a low pressure, first and then bring it up over time. On the right side, we've got an injector for our plasma, and let's turn this pump on here. In order to control how much plasma we're putting in, we've got this pressure pump here, which controls how much we put in at once, and then this signal valve here, which controls the total amount of plasma we're putting in the chamber. So you can see plasma slowly filtering in, and eventually it'll reach a point where it's above 1%-ish, 1.5. So this air alarm went to warning, and this turned off. So if we check our content, we'll see it's above 1.5 because, again, this valve closing doesn't immediately stop injecting. You've still got gas in these two pipes, which is why we set it below 3% so that we have a little bit of runway for that happening. We've got our scrubber pulling out everything except oxygen and plasma. So right now it's scrubbing nothing. Eventually it'll be scrubbing tritium out once we're creating tritium. And then this filter makes it so that our tritium comes off this side and goes through a radiator to cool it down so we don't have hot tritium. Again, hot tritium's dangerous, better to cool it down than not. And everything else is just going out to our waste storage, which is venting to space. Finally, we've got our coolant, which is running clockwise through a pipe snake, being controlled by this signal valve here. When it opens, we'll cool down what's in our chamber. So I'm going to, real quick, I'm going to open this manually to show what it looks like. So when this is open, you can see the temperature in the chamber slowly drop down. And since frezon is such a potent coolant, it's going to drop down pretty quickly. But under normal conditions, that is being controlled by this air alarm here. So when we ignite it, which is over here, we've got our advanced remote connected to this igniter. So once we press the button, it'll catch fire. It wasn't hot enough to sustain the burn, so we're going to need to open it again. Now, still not enough. Come on. Alright, the reason this is taking a bit is because every time we ignite it, we trigger this air alarm and the frezon starts going through. So for this, I'm going to turn this off, which prevents our frezon from moving for a little bit, so we can actually start the fire. Now we've got our fire going, and we can see tritium coming through here in our inlet, and it's going into this filter, which will cool it down. So we'll enable this pump again, which will probably cool things down, but hopefully not enough to stop the reaction. Yep, we're stable at this point, so we can watch it. And once it gets above 550, we'll see this on the right turn to a warning, and this will open this and allow the frezon to come through. We can see it cooled down pretty quickly, and wow, that was way too much cooling. You can see the reaction stop because we cooled it so fast. So have a little bit too much cooling in there for what we're doing, so we can, to prevent that, we can add more mass to the chamber. So I'm going to raise this up to like 550. Again, in order to start the reaction, turn this off so we don't actually accidentally cool it. Wait for this to fill. and ignite. I've got a bit of a sustained reaction going. You can see as the plasma amount drops below 1.5%, this valve opened up again and allowed plasma to come in. We're going to make sure this is on so that we actually get cooling when we need it in a bit. Oh my god, it happened again. Come on, stay lit. There we go. Now it's staying lit. Maybe. Come on. Stay on fire. There we go. So again, this is happening because our igniter is right on top of our air sensor. So if you're building this yourself, don't put your igniter right on top of your air sensor. When you press the igniter, it makes the tile it's on really hot for a tiny amount of time. And since it's so hot, it's triggering this air alarm and starting our cooling way before we actually need cooling. And it's dropping us below the reaction temperature. So again, once we reach 550 Kelvin, we should see this come through, and that pushes our frezon through and drops us below 550. Stay lit, stay lit. Yeah. Now that we see this is working, we can increase our temperatures, so we'll come over here. Temperature, and set it up to like 650, not 6550. And same one over here. So now once we reach 650, we should see our coolant turn on and our fuel turn off. That dropped the temperature back down, which then enables our fuel to come back in and continue burning. And we are fluctuating a lot right now. Ideally, you want to not drop very far below 650 Kelvin, because again, the hotter your reaction is, the more efficient it is. In order to keep temperatures higher, what you can do is either fill the chamber with some other gas to act as a thermal buffer. People like to use water, but you can also use straight frezon in there. It works just fine. It's a little bit wacky, but it gets the job done. The other thing you can do is just increase the pressure in the burn chamber. So if we set this to 1500, sure we're still burning, so don't drop the temperature below 100 degrees Celsius. The reason it's dropping is we're adding a bunch of cold oxygen in there, which naturally drops the temperature as it mixes. And so by increasing the pressure on this, we increase the total amount of gas that's in this chamber. The more thermal mass you have, the more of a buffer you have, basically. The coolant removes more or less the same amount of heat no matter what you're doing, so the same amount of joules of heat. And so by increasing the amount of thermal mass inside, then when you remove that set amount of joules, it fluctuates a lot less. So we only drop to 500, 400 Kelvin there instead of all the way down to 390-ish. So it looks like we can afford a little bit more, so we'll bump this up to 25. And you can see now our plasma is getting a bit low, so a good thing to do is to bump this up to like 15. Make sure you're injecting enough to keep things moving. Mm, 15 is not enough, so we'll set it to 20. Now we're rising up slowly, so that'll be a good value. And again, once we see this reach 650 Kelvin, you should see this valve close and this valve on the right open. So it closed, this one opened, and we're getting our frezon moving through there, cooling it back down. So what did we drop to? 550, which is a decent number. So it could afford to have more. We could afford to have less coolant going through here. Again, if you're using plasma instead of frezon, you'll be cooling less effectively, so lower pressure there. But no matter what you're doing, it just kind of works. I'm going to let this run for a bit so we can watch tritium come through. And I'm going to time-lapse this so that you can just kind of see it continue to work and not explode. Now for frezon. The reaction is between oxygen and tritium, but the reaction only happens when the temperature is below 73.15 Kelvin and the nitrogen is present as a catalyst. With tritium, the critical part of that reaction was the oxygen supersaturation. The ratio of gases used mattered a lot for preventing the creation of its waste gas, carbon dioxide. The actual gases consumed to make tritium is only a little bit of oxygen and a little bit of tritium. Around 1 oxygen to 1 tritium, the actual amount varies based on the temperature, but it's not that much. However, we needed a lot of oxygen present nearby in order to prevent creation of carbon dioxide. With frezon, however, the ratio of gases present in the air only matters a little. Like, you only need a little bit of nitrogen, a little bit of oxygen, a little bit of tritium to make frezon, and the ratio that you use only impacts basically the speed of the reaction, not whether or not it creates its waste gas. Instead, what governs the creation of its waste gas for frezon is temperature. The colder the mixture is, the more waste as nitrogen is produced instead of frezon. So as much as possible, we want to keep the temperature at a nice balmy 73 Kelvin. Important to note, the creation of frezon does not cool down the air. Creating frezon is completely temperature neutral. Technically, it creates energy because frezon has a ton of thermal mass, but it doesn't cool down the air. Common misconception. What cools down the air instead is a second reaction, which is referred to as the frezon-Coulomb reaction or the nitrous oxide production reaction. The frezon mixes with nitrogen, produces nitrous oxide, and that's endothermic. It sucks heat out of the air. Keen-eared among you will remember that making frezon, nitrogen present as a catalyst, and the order of operation makes it so that the instant we make frezon, that frezon is right next to nitrogen and will react with that nitrogen and cool it down. As mentioned before, heat loss bad. We don't want heat loss. So the fact that this is a second reaction and not the primary one is critical. Creating frezon doesn't cool down the air on its own. We can do as much of that as we like. We can create a ton of frezon. To minimize heat loss, instead, we have to separate the reaction results. We have to separate nitrogen from the frezon as quickly as possible after it gets produced. So these conditions give us 4 goals. Mix oxygen, nitrogen, and tritium. We'll go over the ratios later, but again, those ratios don't actually matter. You can mix those in even, you can mix them whatever ratios you want, it'll work. The second goal is going to be cooling that mixture down to 73 Kelvin. If it's too warm, you won't get any frezon. We'll be using a freezer for that. Just like a regular freezer thermo machine. It works fine. The third goal, we're going to be separating nitrogen from frezon as soon as possible. We're going to be doing what's called one ticking, where for only 1 atmos tick, the frezon and nitrogen are next to each other, and immediately after they're separated. That's the quickest you can do it. You can't get 0 tick because of the order of operations. And the fourth goal, warm the mixture up to 73 Kelvin. Since it's one tick, you're still going to end up creating nitrous oxide. There's going to be a little bit of mixture of frezon and nitrogen. No matter what you do, it's unavoidable, which cools the mixture down. So we're going to need a way to warm it back up between cycles. So let's start building. I'm going to be making what's called 4-filter frezon with fart. Go over what fart is in a bit. It's not an acronym, it's literally flatulence, but the 4-filter part is pretty obvious actually. Just drop down 4 filters in a line. They don't literally have to be in a straight line. You can have them turn a corner if you need, but they should all be in sequence. And next we have a cross intersection, so we do a pipe, build a 4-way, and then down here we're going to have mixers. Like so. We connect this mixer on the side to this filter here, so we get pipes out. Straight so that doesn't connect to this cross. And then for these 2 bottom mixers, we're going to connect them to the next 2 filters using manifolds. Sorry, something's in my throat. I'm using manifolds here to reduce the amount of space that this takes up on the floor. If you don't want to use manifolds, you can just route them around the outside. But it obviously takes up more floor space, so I just recommend using manifolds and layering the pipes on top. This one will be here, connect it here, give us some straight pipes, and a manifold here, and then a manifold here, and then we're going to use the tertiary position. This one will just go straight down. And then I'm going to paint this to make it clear what's going on. So in this middle pipe here, we're going to have frezon being made. This is for nitrogen. I usually make this straight line by oxygen. And this one is for tritium. I'm just going to use brown as the mixture stuff. Just a pipe. There we go. And this last filter up here is going to be where we're pulling out frezon. And then up here is just our waste, so we're going to lay a pipe and color it as waste. Remove that decal. All right. Again, this cross here is going to be where we're making frezon. So inside there is oxygen, nitrogen, tritium, frezon, and waste gases like nitrous oxide. As mentioned previously, one of our goals is to separate nitrogen from frezon as quickly as possible. So to do that, we have this filter here, the first one that it goes through, B for nitrogen. Might be tempted to make this filter for frezon, but consider that what will be in the outlet of this pipe if you were to filter out frezon. You still have nitrogen, oxygen, and tritium, which, reacts to make frezon. Making more frezon sounds good at first, but again, you're going through these filters in sequence, so it's going to be a while until you reach the next filter. That's a lot of time where it's going to be reacting with nitrogen, cooling down, wasting. So better to have this first filter be nitrogen, because removing nitrogen both stops the reaction that can create frezon by removing the catalyst, and also stops the reaction that wastes frezon by removing the reactant. So frezon in this pipe will not have any nitrogen to react to, and the oxygen and tritium in this pipe won't have any nitrogen to react to make frezon. So you immediately stop the reaction by having this filter be for nitrogen. The next 2 filters, or really all 3 of them, the order doesn't matter. I usually do tritium, then oxygen, but again, doesn't really matter. With the last one being frezon. And this last pipe will have our waste gases. If you're being a good atmosian, you can recycle. So going to have a filter here for laughing gas. We'll put it there. And unfortunately, nitrous oxide doesn't have a good single letter representation, so I usually use L for laughing gas. Everything else, you can choose to recycle the other stuff too, but I'm just going to send it to space. You'll see what's in there in a bit, but it's pretty much going to be water. Let's color this up. So we got waste and nitrous oxide. Then should be obvious at this point what these two filters are doing, but they're just acting as a way to mix tritium, oxygen, and nitrogen. We're going to set these filters to use the correct ratio. However, as mentioned, the correct ratio doesn't actually matter. So you just kind of pick numbers and it'll work. We're going to set it to the correct ratio kind of for shits and giggles, but you could turn these on as is and it would create frezon. All right, let's go ahead and hook these up. When making frezon, you'll consume a lot of oxygen and tritium, so having direct lines to your gas storage is a good idea. I'm going to be connecting them with manifolds to the existing manifolds. We'll need tertiary. Like so. And actually, I'm going to create a pump here. And a similar thing with the oxygen. This one is in secondary configuration. With nitrogen, if you keep temperatures above 70 Kelvin, which we strive to, so ideally we're keeping things above 70 Kelvin all the time, you will lose nitrogen over time. But the amount lost is really small that you can actually use regular canisters as your nitrogen supply pretty effectively. So I'm going to set that up here with a T-junction and just a connector port. It's perfectly valid to connect this to your nitrogen line. It works, but to prove a point, I'm going to be using a canister. Then, as a note, if your reaction temperatures are below 70 Kelvin, the reaction is actually nitrogen positive. You'll end up with more nitrogen than you lose, and so you'll have to find a way to remove nitrogen from the system. You do that with a inlet pressure regulator, just right here. However, if you're using canisters, the easy way to remove nitrogen from the system is just to pull the canister out. So, again, using canister works great. I like it. Other people will condemn me for it, but it's my favorite way to do things. Anyway, I usually set the pressure on oxygen to around 500 kilopascal. We can turn this on. We actually get oxygen moving. Here we go. So if we check in here, we've got oxygen. Now it's at 500 kilopascal. And then down here, I usually set my tritium to 100 kilopascal. Get that moving in there. That. And then finally, we're going to need a nitrogen can. And don't use liquid nitrogen canisters. I mean, you can use cold nitrogen, but the liquid ones are very high pressure. So just use a regular nitrogen canister. It works fine. So now we got nitrogen here, tritium in here, and oxygen in here. Yeah, let's paint everything so it looks nice and we can follow things around. So we got tritium line. Got oxygen. And we've got nitrogen. If you remember our 4 goals that we started with, at this point we've accomplished 2 of them. We've got our 3 gases mixing in this pipe here, which again, ratios aren't set yet, but they are mixing. And then we've got this filter here to minimize the amount of mixing of frezon and nitrogen once we do start producing frezon. Next thing is cooling. This is really easy. Just slap down a freezer. The thermo machine, not one of these like chef freezers. So I'm going to put it here. And I usually put this on my oxygen line. Technically, it doesn't matter which location you put this, but I do recommend putting it on oxygen because your oxygen generally is going to be the most like mass in the system. So cooling your oxygen cools everything else down pretty effectively. And we're going to set this to the minimum. For freezers, you can set things to the minimum just by typing 0 and hitting enter. You don't have to type this out. You're on your own. It's much easier to do this, but 73.15 is the minimum for a regular freezer. However, they are able to cool slightly below that. So technically, shouldn't be able to create frezon, but because they go slightly below their target temperature, they are able to. And it might look like we're only cooling the nitrogen, or sorry, we're only cooling the oxygen. Might look like we're only cooling the oxygen right now. However, since we've got these mixers here and here, mixing the oxygen with the other two gases, we actually end up cooling everything, because in this pipe, they all mix and become the same temperature, and when they filter out and rejoin the rest, the temperature slowly drops over time. You do not need a hellfire freezer to do this. However, having a hellfire freezer does make things cool down faster, so you can get started faster. I'm going to just let this run for a bit and cool down. I'm going to set this freezer to 76 Kelvin. That will make it so that we're nice and cold, but not quite at the point where we're producing frezon. That way when I can just go AFK and leave this and come back for the video. But when you're doing this yourself, you can set this to 73 to start making frezon directly. In terms of the 4 goals, we have not gotten the 4th one yet, where we need to reheat our reaction to above 73 Kelvin, because again, we're going to be cooling down very slowly. We want a way to heat it back up. We have not done that yet. I'm going to show you what happens if you don't have the heating. So, see you in a bit. Alright, we're just about good to go. So, got our gases, they're at 74, which again, slightly below the temperature we set it to. That's normal. Going to hook up this freezer into the storage room here, so we got pipe in here. And painted frezon blue. Now we're going to drop to 73. We can show what happens. Temperatures in the chamber is going to slowly drop. Once it hits 73.15, drop down and we start producing frezon, which you can see up there. Now, the temperature is going to keep dropping quote unquote quickly, but it's going to keep dropping because we don't have any way to heat it. And as it drops more and more, we're going to create less and less frezon, and more nitrogen. So if we watch here, we're going to see the amount of nitrogen in here should tick up slowly as we drop down. Now we're still at 70, so we're still nitrogen negative, but eventually it'll drop down. Yep, you can see the nitrogen going up because we're below 70 Kelvin. So, as mentioned before, if you're below 70 Kelvin, this reaction is actually nitrogen positive. If you're above 70 Kelvin, it consumes a little bit of nitrogen. As you drop down, it goes all the way down to 23.15 Kelvin, at which point you're producing mostly nitrogen and very little frezon at all. And so to keep temperatures high, we're going to be using what's called a fart. And a fart is just hot water vapor gotten from mixing tritium and oxygen. So it's a tritium burn. And there's a big story on why we call it a fart, but everyone just calls it a fart nowadays. It's a wet one, it's nice and hot, it's the devil's fart. Show you how to set this up in a moment, but to stop the reaction, if you're ever going and you want to turn it off, all you have to do is turn off one of these mixtures. Or alternatively, instead of turning off the mixture, you can leave it on, but set the mixture to be 100% on one side or the other. So now in this chamber, we've just got oxygen and tritium, which obviously can't create frezon, and they warmed up because we have to inject more oxygen in to keep pressure up. So that's one way that things get warmed up, but it's not enough to cover everything on its own because creating frezon is just so intense. So as you're making it, you'll need some way to warm it up. We'll get into that. All right, for fart, we're going to be creating a little burn chamber here, so we're going to need a igniter, a remote signaler. So I'll use advanced, but same thing either way. I still have one in my bag. Where did I put my multi-tool? There we go. Link the two. And we're going to need a mixer, a passive vent, or we can use an injector. Then we're going to need a passive vent to pull the fart out. Then we're going to seal this off with reinforced plasma windows. And I'm going to use canisters for this. In a proper setup, people will fight over whether or not you should use canisters. I'm going to use tritium and oxygen. However, there's also fart that you can do with plasma and oxygen, because again, plasma oxygen makes tritium, which then you're going to burn into water vapor. So really any setup works. I'm just going to use tritium because that's more pure. Go port. Connector port. We're going to get a tritium canister and an oxygen canister. Obviously, you're not going to have access to canisters out of the admin menu. So just either create a canister on your own or hook these lines up to wherever your tritium is coming from. Easy enough to do. And then the ratio for this is 10% tritium to 90% oxygen. Turn this on. It'll fill up, and then we can set it on fire. We can activate this remote signaler over and over to really catch it up. Then we're going to we got nitrogen in there because it was a regular old room to begin with, but gonna burn nice and hot, and this is now our fart. Creates very high pressure, very hot water vapor, basically. And we're going to take this and rat it down. So we're gonna move it over here. Let's do all the way to the left so we have some space. And we're going to be injecting it into where this cross section is. And that's the reason we made it across, so that we can have a place to put it in. Technically, you can put your fart anywhere in the system. I wouldn't recommend putting it in the tritium. You might burn your tritium. However, you can put it into the oxygen pretty safely, and you can put it into the nitrogen pretty safely. I just put it into the middle because it's a convenient location. So for this, we're going to have a sensor, which will control whether or not we're adding fart. And then on the left side, we're going to do the same setup that you remember before from plasma, where we have a volumetric, a signal valve, and a pressure pump. Then we're going to connect this up and paint it. So this is water vapor. For the most part, there's other stuff in there, but if you're playing on a server with Delta P, which is what breaks Windows basically, you should be careful about this. It is extremely high pressure in there, as you can see. So make sure you're using Windows that won't explode, or fill it up very slowly so that you don't break your Windows. That kind of stuff. Just be careful. Frontier, you don't have to worry about it, but I know upstream you definitely do. This here, these are both still water vapor, but this one is frezon here as well. Then we're going to need an air alarm. And I'm going to put it over I'll put it here. And put tools in the backpack, and we can link this gas pipe sensor with this air alarm. It's going to freak out because it's fucking cold in there. Going to start by disabling everything. We're going to turn temperature on in a moment, but just disable everything so it stops beeping to turn off the noise. Alright, for temperature, we're going to have a warning if the temperature is below, we'll call it 70 Kelvin. The exact number you use, the higher you set it, the more efficient the reaction is. However, you have to be careful when you set it high, because if you go over 73 Kelvin, then you have to wait for it to cool back down to the freezer, which is a slow process. So I usually aim for 70, keeps things relatively simple. However, if you want to be maximally efficient, you can set it to 72. Then we have to link this to, oh wait, we have to actually make sure you enable this after you set it so that it's actually on. And then we'll link so that when we receive a warning, we open, but under normal conditions, we close. So now if the temperature falls below 70 Kelvin, this valve will open. What's going to happen when that valve opens is it's going to let some of this very hot water vapor through. And to control how much we let through, we set it on this pressure valve. So I set it to that. This should be closed for now. And then this volumetric pump we just set to max, and so we push that through, and that warms up what's in this pipe. And how much it warms up in the pipe is determined by this pump, so we'll be adjusting that in a moment. At this point, we can go ahead and cut that off. Cut this off. Actually, we should set this. Get the gas out of there. So, at this point, we're going to set our ratios. So the correct ratios to use, you can get into decimal places, but in general, it's going to be 11.11. So it's going to be 8 oxygen for every 1 tritium. So if you're using this mixture of oxygen and tritium, then it's 88 to 11. Works out well. When you're actually filling the chamber, if you're not using 2 separate mixers and you're using all 3 kind of like separately, then what you're going to use is 80 oxygen, 10 tritium, and 10 nitrogen. So if we set this to 10 and set it, we can turn both of these on. We'll see them. Why are we not seeing them mix? Oh, I didn't set the second one on. There we go. So now they're mixing, and you can see we have 10% tritium, about 80% oxygen, and about 10% nitrogen. So that's more or less the correct mixtures to be using. You see our fart warmed it up a bit too much. So we have to wait for our freezer to cool back down, which is a bit of a pain. But since it warmed up too much, we can set this down to 10. And I'm going to, yes, just wait for this to cool back down, which, again, since we're using a regular freezer instead of a hellfire freezer, it takes a little bit. If you're using a hellfire freezer, it does go faster, but the efficiency ends up the same either way. Actually, on that note, I might as well swap it for a hellfire, since we're for demonstration purposes. And we'll set this to 73. Even with the hellfire freezer, you can see that it takes a little bit because we're cooling down our oxygen, but our oxygen is not every gas in the system, so we have to wait for it to mix to really get that cooling effect going. Almost there. Now we're creating frezon. There we go. Since it got a bit too cold in there, it opened up or it should open up soon. The gas analyzer is lying to us. It's moving a bit too fast. There we go. Now it opened up and injected a bit of fart and was warming up. So to show this is working, I'm going to toggle this off. You can see the temperature fluctuating a lot, but we're creating frezon. So if I come over here, you should see a bunch of frezon in this pipe going into the chamber here. And temperatures are staying relatively consistent. Looks like we got a bit too warm. Gonna turn this back on. Actually, now that we're in a more steady state, we can swap this for a regular freezer. Show that you don't need a hellfire for this. You can just use a regular freezer. Gonna set this even lower. To me, this looks a little bit aggressive, so I'm going to lower the volumetric pump to add the gas more slowly. So I'm going to drop it to like 50. And that doesn't change the amount of hot gas you're pushing in, that changes the rate at which you push it in. So by lowering it, you're saying still warm it up by the same amount, but rather than warming it up instantly, warm it up slowly over time. We should see it drop. We're below 73, we're making frezon. Eventually, go on. It's still warm here. And the reason, again, the reason this is warm is because the oxygen that we're putting in up here is warm, and that warms up the oxygen and kind of keeps everything warm. It's not enough to keep everything warm forever, as you saw before, but it is actually surprisingly effective to just push warm oxygen in to keep the things warm. Now it is really struggling to stay cold. If I turn off this volumetric, definitely saw before that it was cooling down. I don't know why it's not doing that anymore. Should still be working. Oh, the struggles of a live demonstration, I guess. This is too efficient. The injection of warm oxygen is enough to stop the reaction from happening. That is surprising. I'm going to add a second freezer. Try and keep temps low. So maybe this needs 2 freezers. Really, that's not enough either. Alright, 3rd freezer. Yeah, this is, give me a second. Alright, a slight correction is in order apparently. This is slightly too efficient, so a hellfire freezer is needed. Normally, so the less efficient your setup is, the more nitrous oxide gets created. Again, the more nitrous oxide gets created, the more heat gets sapped from the system. When I normally build this, my oxygen in the tank, very cold, because I freeze it in order to reduce the amount of space that it takes up, and because it's cold, when I inject it, you don't get as much in there. If you're building this with warm oxygen, which in most cases you will have warm oxygen, you're going to need a hellfire freezer and to cool down how much heat you're injecting into the system. Anyway, at this point, you can see this consistently below 70. When it drops below 70, this signal valve opens. We can turn this on, and it'll rise back up to above 70 because we're injecting hot gas. So once we see it open, we get a little bit of hot gas in there. It slowly brings it over until it's above 70 again. And I personally think we're still a bit too aggressive, so I'm going to lower the amount of volume that this moves at a time, but I'm going to increase the amount of volume that we're injecting at a time here. So we'll up this to like 25 since we just lowered it by 5. So now we can see we're getting a decent chunk of hot gas and built up, and then slowly emptying it out into the pipes. Personally, I think we could use a little bit more, so we're going to up this up to 50. The ideal is that we see this number rise even after this valve closes, so it keeps rising up above 70 up to 72 or so. So we could use a little bit more, so we're going to up this up to like, sure, we'll crank it to 100. So it opens, we get a shot of hot gas here. Then as it closes, we still have the hot gas pushing into here. And that still doesn't seem like enough, so we're going to raise it again, crank it to 200. There we go. Now we're rising pretty consistently after the valve closes. So while the valve's open, we're pushing hot gas into here. Push this up to 20. 30. Again, we're looking to see that once this valve closes, that this temperature keeps rising for a little bit after it closes. It is still dropping, so we're going to crank it up to 50. It's remaining open, continuing to remain open. Alright, needs more gas. There we go. Now we're really pushing gas in there. And you can see it draws back down until it's cold, then it heats up. And once it drops below 70, it opens up, warms back up to like 70-ish, 71. So we could raise this up a little bit more, so we'll set to 500, see if we hit 72 in there. Roughly 72. So yeah, at this point, everything's functional. It's working as intended. You combine this with your tritium production. You're going to need to find space for everything. I'll let you figure that out on your own because that's part of the fun of Atmos. But as you create tritium, it goes into your storage and then it gets injected here. Simple enough. Create your frezon, then your frezon comes over into frezon storage. Suppose at this point I can do a time lapse of how much frezon we're making. So if we do I've got a hard suit. So admin goes my way in there. I need the admin ghost so I can actually. There we go. So I'll sit in here and we'll do a quick time lapse of how much frezon we're making. Obviously, unrealistic numbers considering we have an infinite source of tritium, but you know, if you're actually out there mining on the frontier, you will have a lot of tritium. So have fun, make some money. Hopefully this helps. But wait, there's more. Alright, math jump scare. You don't have to watch this part. This is some advanced wizardry knowledge, but I figured I'd include it because questions always come up about what's happening. If you've been an atmosian on Frontier for long enough, you're eventually going to come across the concept of runes. Runes are basically just any setup that has a bunch of filters and mixers layered on top of each other. It looks really cool, really dense, they work well, but there is specifically the rune, like capital V, proper noun. That one is called the rune because what it does is it converts plasma directly into frezon with no other gases needed. The reason that's useful is because obviously you can create plants which produce plasma. And so if you do your botany right, you end up with a plant that produces an infinite amount of plasma. You feed it a bunch of fertilizer so it spits out a ton of plasma. You convert that plasma into frezon. So anyway, I'm going to go over the math for that. This is advanced tech. You should not attempt to do this in most cases, but it's cool to know that it exists and it's a cool thing to look for and strive to do. The basic idea is that nitrous oxide can be decomposed into both nitrogen and oxygen, but to create it, you mix frezon and nitrogen. And that reaction back and forth ends up being positive in terms of both oxygen and nitrogen. So by doing everything very efficiently, you can end up with infinite gas for oxygen and nitrogen. You can't recreate your plasma, but you can create infinite oxygen and nitrogen through clever recycling. So I've got Desmos open just as a way to type, and things look pretty. It's not; these aren't actually equations. We're not going to have any graphs. I'm just going to type this in. So starting with the plasma reaction. So if you mix one plasma with 0.4 oxygen, this is the maximum efficiency that you can do, you're going to end up with 1 tritium. We're going to shrink this down just like, okay, so it's impossible to hit 0.4 oxygen exactly because that's when you're at 700 Kelvin. So as a conservative number, I'm dialing back that to 0.7 oxygen consumed per tritium produced, which is what you are if you're at about 650 Kelvin, which is the number I aim for usually. It's a lot safer. It is definitely possible to burn at a consistent 690 Kelvin, which a number of people in the gas Discord strive for, but it's much more complicated to do that. And frankly, the efficiency gained by improving the temperature of your tritium burn, not that great anyway, so this is fine. To make frezon, frezon's next. So 1 tritium plus 8 oxygen produces 8.5 frezon and 0.5 nitrogen. A tiny bit of, again, if you're perfectly at 73.15 Kelvin, you're not going to end up with any nitrogen. Whoa, did not mean to press that. You end up with 9 frezon and 0 nitrogen. However, again, we're assuming that you're going to miss the mark at least by a little bit, and so conservatively, we're going to say 8.5 frezon and 0.5 nitrogen, which is about 70 Kelvin. So again, as we saw before, that's relatively easy to hit and stay consistent around, so this is a good number to use, in my opinion. Next, we can take our 8.5 frezon that we made, mix that with 42.5 nitrogen. That's going to create 51 laughing gas. Again, nitrous oxide doesn't have a single letter because it's already conflicting with nitrogen and oxygen, so I just use LS for laughing gas. And then 51 laughing gas can be decomposed if you warm it up into 51 nitrogen and 25.5 oxygen. So your total equation becomes 1 plasma plus 8.7 oxygen plus 42 nitrogen nets you 51 nitrogen and 25.5 oxygen. That's clearly nitrogen and oxygen positive, so by consuming, essentially what this tells you is that if you have the right setup, you can turn plasma into oxygen. So what's 25.5 minus 8.7? 16.8. Copy this. Then 51 minus 42 is an easy 9. So for every plasma, you can theoretically create about 16, 17 oxygen and 9 nitrogen. Obviously, in practice, you actually want to save some of that frezon that you've made up here, actually so that you can sell it. However, this kind of just shows that this is a positive reaction. Now, it's not quite this simple because you have to deal with heat. So we're going to include that. 9 oxygen plus 1 tritium. So this is our fart. Creates 2.84 megajoules. I'm just going to use J, but these are megajoules. It's a lot of energy. And then in order to warm your nitrous oxide, we're going to assume that it's at 23 Kelvin, which is the lowest temperature it'll get to naturally, all the way up to 850, where it actually starts to decay. That requires 1.7 megajoules. So yeah, your 51 laughing gas plus 1.7 megajoules is equal to your 51 nitrogen and 25.5 oxygen. So you have to account for the fact that this requires energy. It's not a free thing. And accounting for that, the total reaction becomes something like 1.6 plasma plus 14.5, I can type correct, oxygen plus 42 nitrogen creates 51 nitrogen and 25.5 oxygen. So slightly worse rates than this because you have to account for the energy. However, still positive. You're getting more nitrogen, you're getting more oxygen. Additionally, this doesn't account for the fact that this oxygen you've created is actually really hot. It's at above 850 Kelvin. And so by using this in your frezon setup, you don't have to heat it as much with fart. So technically you're reducing how much fart you're using by using this oxygen instead of this oxygen. It's a whole mess, but it ends up working out pretty well. And this gives you the idea that, hey, if we do this correctly, you can turn plasma into frezon with no extra parts, basically. And that is the idea of the rune. Again, this is even among advanced atmosians, this is considered like wizardry tech that people don't try to emulate in most cases, but it is possible. And if you have a 10-hour shift where you're just sitting on a big station, have a ton of time to work with, it can be very cool to set up. So have fun. Hopefully you learned something. Enjoy huffing frezon or selling it, do whatever, but huff some frezon. It's fun.